Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should get started. There's just some things I need to say up front. We are recording this event, and also either later today or tomorrow we'll send out an evaluation form about the seminar as well. So please take less than 60 seconds and fill it in. No more than 60 seconds, I promise. Okay, and then I'd like to welcome Nick Peemster to sit. So Nick's been doing he's been working with some of the guys in the computer science, or spending some time there.
Visiting Gary Morrison.
But he's from Georgia Tech. And I think he's just actually started presenting his own MOOC late last month. So we have somebody who's actually doing a MOOC. I can't remember, have you participated in any other MOOCs?
I have done one. Yes.
Okay, so we've got a wealth of experience here that we need to tap into. And as you can see, the title, A Remookable Experience. So that was a very interesting way to put it. But over to you, Nick.
Thanks Ian. Thank you for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I should just first acknowledge the two co-conspirators that I have who've helped me present or prepare the MOOC. One was a course designer at Georgia Tech, Roshali Moog, and Mohammed Shabazz is the TA for the course, who's also my PhD student. None of us had actually done anything with MOOCs before. The course designer had done some online distance learning type stuff, but we basically all kind of jumped into it really without knowing anything about it. So I should preface this with saying that I guess people say the definition of an expert is you know a little bit more than everyone else, and I probably just know a little bit more than you, but not much. I really just started doing this, like 3-4 weeks ago. So this talk is really not meant to be authoritative. It's really just my personal experiences and impressions from doing this, and some of the lessons that I've learned from teaching a MOOC and trying to put one together. So first of all, why did I decide to do it? Then we'll talk about how the MOOC was developed, the steps that we've taken to develop it. Then I'll talk a little bit about who's taking it, to the extent that I've paid attention. There's also kind of an interesting question of what does it actually mean to take one of these courses. Then I'll talk about some various lessons learned. I'll try to elevate a little bit from my experience some of the things that I think are good takeaways, and various suggestions I have for probably not you, but people who design these platforms and things like that, who may listen at some point. So first of all, why did I decide to do this? Well, actually, I guess part of my motivation comes from the way that I think about research. I'll talk about it a little bit later in the talk, but first and foremost, I do research, and then teaching is, as we know, it can be an afterthought. But the way that I approach my research is very empirical, which is to say that, like, I work in computer networking. We draw a lot of conclusions from gathering data, and we try not to draw conclusions without gathering data. So I thought, well, let's gather some data about this. There's a lot of hype about these MOOC things. There are many opinions. The New York Times called last year the year of the MOOC, and at the same time we have people like the editor of communications of the ACM basically saying these things are terrible, and he wants them to go away. I find that, as I was reading more and more about MOOCs, I found that most people who have strong opinions appear to not have actually taught a MOOC. I didn't gather any statistics about that, but I thought, well, it would be nice to have an opinion about this, but I'd like to actually know what I'm talking about. So let's gather some data. Let's actually do one. So that was my first motivation, was let's just sort of figure out what this is all about. The second was pedagogy. I actually, one of my colleagues actually said at one point, she was elated to get tenure because she said, now I don't have to pretend to care about teaching anymore. Which I thought was interesting, telling, maybe a little bit sad, but in some ways very true. I've also long thought that lecturing is kind of a demoralizing affair. It can be. You go in every term, you basically say the same thing. There are a bunch of people, half of whom don't really want to be there. Half the people are not listening to you anyway. They're browsing the web or doing what they do. And I thought basically, well, this appears to be shaking things up. It's really a chance to kind of explore new ways of teaching. And I'd always kind of wanted to do something besides just show up and recite the same material over and over. But of course, you get busy, and then the term's upon you, and you're like presenting the same material that you presented last year. There's just no real forcing function to really kind of like change the way you're doing things. So I thought, okay, this is like, if I sign up to do this, this will really change the way that I'm doing things, and more so than I even thought. I'll talk about that as well. And then, of course, the third was a little bit more self-serving. Actually, was just like to get some exposure, fame, I guess you might say. So one of the things that was bothering me, or at least like kept me awake, I guess you could say, is that this topic that I designed the course on is gathering a lot of attention now. I'll talk about that topic just briefly in a second. And I had some role in the history of sort of the roots of some of that research, and I was a little bit, I guess you might say, annoyed at like how certain history was being presented. So I guess when you don't like the way that history is being told, you go write a book yourself, and you rewrite the history. So that I basically figured this would be an interesting way to try to retell the story as I saw it to an audience that might actually listen. So my MOOC is called Software-Defined Networking. I won't get into the technical details in this talk. I'll just try to summarize it in one sentence. The idea basically is that traditionally in computer networking, routers and switches and so forth, they have their own configurations, and network operators go in, they configure each device independently. And there are thousands of these devices across a network. And the idea, so software-defined networking basically shakes this up. It says, well, let's take these devices and just treat them as sort of dumb routers and switches, and let's write high-level Python, Java, C programs that control thousands of switches. So the idea is you kind of have like a single software program that's controlling the network instead of these thousands of low-level devices that are being configured. So that's kind of the gist of what the topic is about. It's pretty exciting. It basically, as a networking researcher, it's very exciting because it just like totally shakes up the way that we think about everything. And it, in many ways, it turns networking into sort of a computer science rooted discipline, in the sense that we can apply things like software testings, programming languages, and so forth. In any case, like in addition to it being extremely kind of hot, trendy, and getting a lot of attention, and there are also really no real-world courses on this yet. There are some being developed now at various universities where people who are doing research in this have now decided they're going to try to teach graduate courses and such. But really, there's nothing out there. There are a couple of books that have like just recently rolled off the presses, but basically almost nothing there. So I thought, okay, well, this is interesting too, because not only is it getting a lot of attention, but there's not a lot of pedagogy out there about this topic. So it seemed like a good way to kind of just like start from a clean slate and just really think outside the box. So not only was it an opportunity to think about new ways of teaching, but the material was also totally new. So I wasn't constrained by, here's an existing syllabus for a standard networking course, and now I've got to figure out like how to turn it into an online thing. I was basically starting completely from scratch, which, as we know from writing and things like that, sometimes it's just easier to start over. And that kind of made things both exciting and convenient. Okay, so that's basically that. I'll just show you like a couple screenshots of what this kind of looks like from inside Coursera. So this is the course. This is basically what it looks like right now. There's a bit more to it, but this is like if you go to the course and you register, this is basically what you see. There's like announcements. There's basically 6 weeks in the course. You can basically click through here and get to the video lectures. I'll show you that in a minute. And if you do that, basically what you see is something like this, which basically allows you to kind of work your way through different weeks. The way that I'm doing it, so people do this in a variety of different ways. I basically am just releasing the content 1 week at a time to kind of keep people from plowing ahead, and it just keeps like comments and forums under control and everything. I'll talk about forums in a little bit, but I'm basically just trying to dribble it out 1 week at a time. So I'll talk a little bit about lecture production in just a minute as well, but basically, just to sort of break things out for you, the way that I've been doing it is every week has 1 or sometimes 2 modules. And I'll talk about what this was totally foreign to me as well. I was like, module? What's a module? I teach lectures. But basically, trying to organize these modules around a particular concept, and then break, and typically a concept takes longer than like 10 or 15 minutes to explain. So basically the exercise is always to kind of take that concept and break it down into things that could be explained in 10 or 15 minutes. So every week basically has 1 or 2 of those, and every sort of module I broke into what I call lessons, and every lesson was like somewhere between 8 minutes and 15 minutes. Okay, so you might think, what can you possibly say in 15 minutes? And it turns out you can say a lot. You can actually say a lot in 8 minutes. I'll come to that as well. But anyway, that's the basic idea. The other thing that I did, and I'll talk about this too, is every week I've now, in addition to putting my own lectures into the course, I've also done some interviews with other people in the field who kind of, some might say, know more than I do about the topic. So that's been kind of interesting. I'll talk about that as well, and how I thought of it and what I think, what benefits I think it has. So that's kind of what the student sees, part of what the student sees. This is what I see. Basically, I'll come to this towards the end, but the interface leaves a lot to be desired. But basically, to put together these weeks and modules and lessons, you basically, you say that you want to add one of these things. It gives you a row. You say whether you want to add like a lecture, a quiz, or an assignment or whatever. And then here you get one of these things, and you can say there's a bunch of unintuitive options about, is it published or not, and when is it visible. I still don't understand the difference between published and visible, to tell you the truth. When is it due? I'll talk about due dates as well. And then you can basically upload the thing, like you can ask for subtitles. Presumably Coursera outsources that to somebody. You can ask for subtitles in like 20 different languages. So I started with English. I figured that was a good place to start. But that's basically that's kind of where I spend my time, kind of on the site. I actually try to spend as little time on the site as possible, which I'll come to towards the end. Okay, so that's kind of what things look like at a 10,000 foot level. How did we develop this course? This is kind of the step-by-step, or sort of to break it down. Actually, so I went into to meet the instructional designer, and she said, okay, well, let's start with a lesson plan, and maybe each one of these, she's kind of explained to me modules and lessons. She said, yeah, maybe we should have some learning objectives for each of these modules. Learning objectives, what's that? So that was actually one of the things that was sort of eye-opening to me, was that as a researcher, when you, at least in the U.S., like when you're hired to start working at a university, they expect you know how to do your research. That's obviously what you're hired for. But they also expect that you know how to teach, which is like a totally false assumption, because when did we ever learn how to teach? So this has been really interesting, because as a result of doing it, I've had to basically work with a course designer who said, oh, what about learning objectives? What about this? And actually I thought, maybe I should have one of these people for my classroom course as well. But in any case, so we started basically with just a Google Doc, like a course lesson plan. What is each module going to be? How are we going to break those modules into lessons? What are the learning objectives going to be for each lesson? And then how are we going to test those things? Kind of probably standard to anyone who thinks about education. But it was kind of new to me. Top-down design. So basically I started with, here are the concepts I want to teach, right? So I want to teach, this high-level idea of separating the network devices from the software control. And then I want to basically dive into some details of the mechanics of how that's implemented. And then I want to talk about applications and things you can build on that. So I started with kind of these big ideas of things I wanted to do. And then I basically just continued subdividing until I got these like 10-minute lectures, put lectures in quotes for a reason, which I'll come to in a bit. But so that, it sounds easier than it actually was. I mean, once you get the hang of it, it is actually not too hard. But I mean, this was kind of quite a learning experience. I mean, my first take at this, I figured, well, I'll talk a little bit more about this too, but I said, well, look, I've spoken in front of a camera before. I've done some TV interviews, and I've lectured, so this is going to be easy. I'll just like take some lecture. I'll like sit in front of a camera, and like that'll be that. So I walked in with my like, you know, first lecture from when I covered this topic in a grad networking course, and it was a complete disaster. I mean, it was like obviously wasn't going to fit into 10 minutes. Like, you know, I thought, okay, well, I'll just chop this up. Quickly realized I was going to just have to rewrite the whole thing. So definitely figuring out what constitutes a 10-minute lecture is tricky. Even now, I'm still kind of learning, like, as I plan out my modules and lessons, I think, okay, well, I'm going to spend one lesson on this, and then I quickly get into it, and I realize there's no way I can cover that all in 10 minutes, and I have to kind of, like, break it out into more. But fortunately, you can kind of go with the top-down design, and I've had reasonable luck with that. Like, if I start with a fairly coarse structure, if I'm going along and I realize, like, oh, this is way too much for, you know, a one lesson, I can break it up. So after that, once you sort of have a plan of like what's going to go into each 10 minutes there, there's sort of the production aspect of this, I might say, the filming and editing and so forth. The assignments, there's the syllabus, which is not too different from a real like classroom class. And then there's also the actual, what I would call operation, or manning these forums, which sounds kind of crazy, and it's actually not as bad as it seems, so I'll talk about that. But let me first talk about the production. So I'll show you a little bit of it as well. So first take, and this was sort of on the advice of not my instructional designer, but some other folks at Georgia Tech. Well, we've got this studio, why don't you just go like do some recording in there? I said, okay, well, sounds good. So I started in this studio. This I snagged from Wikimedia Commons. It actually doesn't look too much different than that. You probably have them here, actually, right? So you've got a studio, and then you've got like some dude on the side who's like looking at you through this window, and you're supposed to like speak, and then they're going to edit it. And I thought, okay, no problem. Like as I said, no problem. I've spoken in front of a camera before. This was just like totally intractable to me. Maybe other people have, like I said, this is my personal experience. So other people may have totally different experience, but I found this to be just horrible. So one is like I found the studio to be really distracting. Like lots of people watching me. So I had basically this camera, and then like my TA and the instructional designer there, kind of getting me nervous, and then this dude over here on the side, and actually this guy in the periphery. Like you don't think about it, but actually just seeing this person move just would break my train of my speech, just totally messed me up, and it was frustrating. Actually, I was going to try to get the raw video from my first time in the studio. I haven't managed to dig it out yet, but maybe I'll bring that back sometime. I mean, it was pretty bad. It was probably one of the more frustrating experiences I've had in years. So other things too was that the studio time was of course limited. There's one studio. There are a bunch of people trying to do various distance learning things, make other MOOCs, etc. It's expensive, not to me, but to somebody. Also, I found that, so I did do the course overview video in the studio, and I actually just found that in comparison to what I could do, some of the post-production quality just like wasn't to my liking. For example, just pulling out, I mean, obviously it was a little bit green at the time I did the overview as well, but just pulling out things like stammers and various mistakes, I was like, I could do better than that. So And then I'll talk about other things I've done in lecture production where I just, I haven't tried going back to the studio and having them do it, but I mean, there's a lot of control that I enjoyed having that just didn't seem like it would take about 10 times the time in the studio. So I think there's a little bit of a halfway point, which I'll suggest, but certainly it wasn't not quite as simple as just rolling into the studio and going for it. The other thing is that faculty members, I think in general, they like their autonomy. That's sort of why they're in academia in the first place. They don't like people telling them what to do, when to show up to certain things, etc. They're also very busy. And something like show up at Thursday from 8:30 to 10 a.m. Just didn't work for me. So I think I'll come back to the point of autonomy later. Anyway, I already mentioned the point. This is a lot different than a TV interview, which was a big surprise to me. Okay, so take two, and actually this somewhat came out of what I was saying. It also came somewhat out of necessity because the course, I wanted to do the course this summer and I was coming here, was to basically just like do it on Camtasia and use my laptop basically as the camera. So I think the studio people will claim that the quality suffers. I think there's probably some truth to that, but I also think that it's somewhat bogus in the case of this MOOC recording stuff for several reasons. I think one thing I've noticed is that I can take my time recording, I can take breaks, I can do it whenever I want. If I feel like I'm in the zone at midnight or something, that's fine. Whereas if you've got a scheduled time from 8:30 to 10, it's like, well, if you decide you totally want to rework something, like the way that you're presenting something, you just don't have time. You've got to come back. It doesn't work. The other thing, and I'll show this a little bit in a demo in just a minute. It's like screen captures from a laptop are really easy, and this is one thing that I've used a lot in terms of just like demonstrating certain things, like code and so forth. I felt like just manipulating things myself. I could show exactly what I wanted to show, highlight, etc. I got a lot of control that I really liked. I was actually worried about the recording quality from the laptop. I actually bought like an external mic. Turned out the internal mic was better. There are certain concerns. Various rooms and things appear to be better than others, obviously, right? But yeah. The other thing is, I found that we'll see. I mean, the production quality is not what you'd call professional. Definitely, if and when I do this again, I would probably take the videos I produced and send them to the studio for remastering or whatever, and like enhancements. But I think the content is really what matters the most. In the forums, I see suggestions all the time of cover this, cover that, this or that. I've never heard anyone complain about the quality of a recording. I mean, no one's saying like, oh, that's too fuzzy, or your face is too small, or I wish you wouldn't look down, like please look at the camera. Like, even though I know that there are certain mistakes I'm making, no complaints. So yeah, I mean, that's a place where I think, despite being a perfectionist, I'm willing to cut a corner. It does take a little getting used to, just like anything, probably the studio as well. And then, of course, I say you have to do your own editing. Probably that's not true in general. I've been doing my own editing, which takes time. But yeah, I guess it's a trade-off of control versus investment of time. Okay, so producing the lectures. I would say as a general rule, about 10 to 15 minutes of lecture takes about 2 hours of recording and editing. So that sounds horrible, but at the end of the talk, I'll explain why I think it's actually not that horrible. This does not include the time to, like, your normal preparation, like preparing the slides and so forth. Most of that time, oh, by the way, I think that's probably going down. So at first it probably took me longer. I would say now I can do a 10 to 15 minute thing in an hour to an hour and a half. But 2 is probably conservative. Right. So this is pretty different from a usual lecture. In terms of, like, that doesn't seem like that much time and you're spending so much time preparing it. You get better. I found that the biggest lesson I learned is that silence is pretty easy to edit out. particularly if you're not agitating too much, right? Cuts are okay. So it's harder to edit out stammers and you know, if you're speaking too fast, it's hard to edit that kind of thing. So speaking slowly and just saying the same thing again if you screw up is actually, it works just fine. The other thing I've started to do is just get comfortable with just practicing while you know, you think like, oh man, this camera is like recording, like I gotta do it perfectly and this and that. And actually, probably anyone who's done this a lot just realizes or recognizes that, this is all gonna get cut out later anyway, so I can just do this again and again and again until I'm happy with it. And I don't have to start over. Like when I first started doing this, I try to do a single take, you know, 10-minute thing, and then I mess up 3 minutes in and I've got to do the whole thing over again. It's kind of obvious in hindsight that you don't have to do that, but it took a while to get used to that. Obviously, finding a quiet, well-lit location, also places that don't echo, like, you know, my house has hardwood floors, so not the best place to do the recording. So you got to find the right place, but if you're conscious of it, it can be done. It takes a lot of patience at first. I mean, there's a lot of new environment, new tools, etc. But actually, it's pretty fun when it comes right down to it. And just not only working with technology, but also realizing that you can distill these, you know, hour-long. Actually, you can distill like I'm going to talk about it later. You can distill like a 45-minute lecture into like 10 minutes, pretty easily if you think about how to do it. And I think it's really kind of fun to think about that. Just generally how this works, as I mentioned, determining the learning objectives, researching the topic, writing up the slides. I got a general format going where I do like a summary and outline, trying to do like 7 or 10 content slides and then wrap up. So there's some continuity on both sides. Like, here's where we are. Here's, you know, blah 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 blah. Again, here's what we did. Next time we're going to do this. So just try to develop some continuity. Some of the lectures, I'll show you one, like has a, you know, they have demonstrations, and those are generally like require a little bit more planning. Just where are you going to put stuff on the screen? How am I going to show stuff? I think if you were really anal about it, you could probably write out a script and drawings and things like that. I just sort of mess around with it until I'm happy. So, okay, so then plan it all out, record. As I mentioned, sometimes you do the planning and recording at the same time, probably takes a little longer. The thing about the recording, of course, is that you kind of want to do the recording of a lesson in one place for consistency. It'd be kind of weird if, like, suddenly halfway through the lecture you've changed clothes or, like, got a new haircut. So that's, you know, I mean, that comes back to the studio versus, like, doing it on your own. Really, you want to do it in one sitting, so you better have time. You know, you better have 2 hours, or, you know, at least an hour to sit down and like take your, you know, do your video capture. That can be a challenge, especially for, you know, faculty members who are overcommitted with short attention spans and so on, and constantly being interrupted. So that's been a challenge. In fact, I think probably when I was doing this, and then I told the people at Georgia Tech, like, oh, and by the way, like, I'm out of here, I'm going to Cape Town. I'm sure they were like panicked. But in fact, I found it way better. In fact, I've gotten way more done here than when I go back at Georgia Tech, because there's just like too many interruptions, way too much going on. Whereas here, I've got like nice quiet space, can focus, etc. So that's been a challenge. One thing I you know, you don't think about these things, right? But I did one of these in my office at Georgia Tech, and of course there are windows, and I was sitting there, and you know, I did one take, and then I wanted to insert some context at the beginning of the lecture, and it was the afternoon, like sun was setting, right? And I was like, oh man, I got to get this done before the sun sets, because the intro is going to be in the dark, and then the next part's going to be in the light. So just things you don't think about normally do come up. Then there's the editing process. I'll just talk a little bit about that. For me, that's basically just mainly cutting out silence and mistakes. I've also done some transitions. I'll show them, and then uploading it, which you know, is what it sounds like. One thing that's kind of interesting, and again, it kind of takes a little getting used to, is when you teach a regular course, like everything's going in sequence, right? Because it's real time. Here, you actually have some flexibility. I mean, obviously, like, we do think sequentially, so it's easier to sort of prepare your lectures one after the other, and prepare the lecture from start, record the lecture from start to finish. But actually, you can do things out of order. So I have, for example, realized, like, oh, I need to do a little more research on that lecture. Let's just go record the next one. Or even within a lecture, I've like done it and then realized, oh, I actually need to insert some stuff at the beginning so there's some more context, or I'd like to slot a demo in right there. And you can do things completely out of order. And actually, even as you plan, right? So some of the lectures, I'll show you one with some slides and then a demo. You can like do the take for the slides first and then do the demo later. And it's sort of like takes some thinking, and it's a different way of thinking of how you do your lecture, because usually we think about, oh, I'm going to do these slides, then I'm going to get up, I'm going to swap over, I'm going to do this demo, and then I'm going to go back to the slides. And actually, you don't have to do things that way. I kind of imagine it must be a little bit like how when actors and actresses film movies, they do a take of a scene, they have no idea like where it fits in. Like they do all the scenes in Paris because that's where they are at the time, but then later it gets put together. It's probably not that extreme, but you can kind of make it as extreme as you want. So that's one thing that I thought was kind of really interesting, in just terms of like changing the way that you think about stuff. The other thing is that there are kind of like new modes of producing lectures. So one is that the on-screen demonstrations, which I've talked about. These videos lend themselves really nicely to an on-screen demonstration, which I'll show. The user can kind of see things in life size. So if I want to show, like, here's what you want to type into your terminal window or Emacs buffer or what have you, they can see things exactly as it would look on their screen, which is definitely in contrast to if I'm sitting here projecting something up here and then you go home later and you're like, well, oh man, what was that? I couldn't quite see. Totally forgot. Oh, forget it. Okay. Whereas here, it's there. The user can kind of see it as they can work alongside, and so forth. So the other thing I did was, and I got this idea from a book actually. There's a networking textbook out, and they had these nice little sidebars of interviews with famous networking people, and they just asked them a bunch of questions. And I thought that's kind of cool. Why not just do that as interviews as part of the course? And so this was fun, actually. I basically identified, 6 or 7 people who, had seminal contributions to this area, and I said, "Hey, I'm doing this Coursera course. Would you like to do an interview, etc.?" And much to my pleasure, everyone said yes, including people who I think probably would not say yes ordinarily, right? Because it's like, hey, would you mind getting on a Google Hangout for a half an hour of your time, and like I'll just roll through questions. And by the way, 10,000 people might watch this. They're like, oh, okay. So, I did a little bit of that. So actually, I can show you just a little bit too of the way kind of the. I'll show you like just a little bit of an example from a lecture. This is an example of like a place where I've like taken the slides and then transitioned into an on-screen template.
With a single open vSwitch to connect those 3 nodes. Even without a controller, we can use DPCTL to communicate with that switch.
So what I'm doing here is basically showing them conceptually what things are looking like, and then when I go to the demo, it's basically exactly
using Miniman. We set up our single topology with an open vSwitch and the option that specifies that we want to use a remote controller. At this point, we have
the
3
other
hosts
thing that goes on here
connected by a single open vSwitch. But
as
we have not yet
I go through the demo,
instantiated a controller.
Some of the things here actually take a while. Like I don't know if we'll get there, but you can cut out things that, it's like, oh, this thing's loading. This is really boring, right? And in a classroom, you're like, well, let's wait for the thing to boot, or oh crap, it's not working as I thought. Hold on, let me debug it. Whereas I'm like, okay, we'll just cut that. We'll cut to the chase and just show the good stuff. So that's definitely one thing that I don't know if I've done it here, but
therefore,
yeah.
If we try to ping,
you can see
the
like
hosts and topology, we see
so I've sped this part up.
But the hosts
you'll see in just a minute
actually
like,
reach one another. This
see,
is
I just
also
like skip ahead
corroborated
there.
by looking at DPCTL.
And you can see that I'm like messing with windows and stuff,
If
and
we
I'm like
dump the flow
not
table
typing everything
entries
in real
the
time.
switch,
Like I'm able to just cut.
we will see that the
And,
switch actually has
It
no
looks as
flow
though
table
like
entries,
I'm doing it in
which
real
is
time,
why
but I've
the
sped
hosts
things
are
up.
unable.
So that's like one example of how I've managed to kind of use editing to make a demo that sort of kind of fits well. I wanted to just show you like just for like fun, just 10 seconds of like just an example. This is actually a lecture I'm preparing right now, where I'm taking the raw video, and you'll kind of see like the example of what I was saying in terms of just like cutting out silence and mistakes. So that actually just recorded this morning.
In a control program such as the one that we are talking about, different modules affect the same traffic. For example, the same traffic that's being monitored is also subjected to the routing firewall.
So you can see like I say something, I don't like it, I'm like, okay, well now I'll just go back and say it again. So and then it's really just as simple as going back and like editing out the stuff you don't want. So that's kind of basically the way that I go about it. So, okay, just some lessons. I think one of the things I think is that lots of money is really not needed. I think there's a lot of hype around MOOCs, and there's a lot of attention on them. People want them to be flashy, et cetera, et cetera. I think flashiness, sure, it's always nice to have a slick video, but actually, students just want content. They want it clearly delivered, right? So spending the effort on the clear delivery is just as important as making the video shiny. Camtasia works just fine, I think, in my conclusion. This was another thing is I thought 15 minutes, like what can you say in 15 minutes? Well, a 15 to 60 minute lecture actually compresses to 15 minutes pretty well, and you can kind of see how, right? In a classroom, you're mumbling. You might try to do a demo and things, you're typing and things don't quite work. Some students ask questions, which of course is good, but if basically that 15 minutes of content easily expands to 60 minutes. So you might think intuitively like, this is garbage. Like, what can I fit into like 10 or 15 minutes? This is totally lightweight. In fact, no, it's basically just more dense, right? Or I should say it's more distilled. Right? You're cutting out your ums and repeats. You're cutting out the demo that didn't work. You're cutting out the guy in the front row who's asking a question every 5 seconds, right? So it actually does distill pretty well. Another thing that I've found kind of interesting is that, of course, the students are watching the lectures that I made 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? Which is kind of this interesting time-shifting effect that's going on, where you're getting questions in the forums and everything about things that you were like really deep into 2 or 3 weeks ago. So that's very different, obviously, than a classroom lecture where you just reviewed or prepared the material. You're going in, the students are like totally on the same page, doing in sync, and here you're kind of ahead of them. So there's obvious disadvantages to that, right? Because your head isn't exactly where theirs is. So if they're asking you a really detailed question, you have to be like, oh well, hold on, let me just go swap in like what exactly that was again. On the other hand, it does have some advantages because you can see, for example, what students are having trouble with, what they're spending the most time on, what they find the most interesting. So as you're kind of doing the later parts of the course, you can tailor, right? You can say, well, remember you had trouble with this, or remember this. And because you're doing it right now, you don't have to remember like, oh yeah, 2 weeks ago these guys had trouble with, with this thing. Let me remind them about that. You can kind of do it, you can kind of anticipate without having to have great notes about what you need to anticipate. So that's kind of neat. MOOCs they're asynchronous, right? The students can watch the lectures pretty much whenever they please. They're autonomous, right? The student can watch them in their pajamas, in the bedroom, etc. I think this is a big reason for why they're so popular, right? We don't have to be doing things at a predefined pace. Something that isn't really talked about, though, is that it's also an asynchronous process for the producer of the course, right? And I think that's also a huge advantage, right? So the fact that the producer can, in this case me, right, can record when he or she feels like it, can take advantage of being ahead, etc. there are a lot of advantages to this asynchronous nature of things if you know how to take advantage of it. Now, I'm not going to get into like the philosophical debate about MOOC, so this is kind of the only thing that I wanted to say about it, which is that I really don't think the medium is going to replace the lecture hall. It certainly has its place in terms of all kinds of things we can spend the rest of the hour talking about. But I think there's definitely still a place for the lecture hall. It may not be lecturing, it may be discussion based on videos people watch, for example. I think it's definitely, this mode is way more efficient for delivering certain kinds of content. It's also way more fun, and it also can be perfected, refined, refreshed, and so forth. Okay, so assignments. In terms of developing quizzes, this is probably part of the talk that will change, I think, if I were to give it a year from now. The platform, I'll come back to this too, the platform is basically terrible at anything that is not like a multiple choice or a simple numerical answer. For example, I asked a question, I said, what is the legacy of active networking for software-defined networking? And I had 3 answers in mind, like programmable functions, packet headers, and demultiplexing. And I wanted, point for each, right, or something, right? And all of a sudden, like this simple, right? Okay, 3 things, like type 1 thing, get a point, right? And so I put in, you're supposed to put them in these things called like regular expressions, right, which match on patterns. And I thought, okay, well, I write my regular expressions, fine. All of a sudden, the forms are like blowing up with, you need to put a carriage return here, and I switched the order of this and that, and it's fine. And so I wrote to the Coursera folks, and they're like, oh yeah, this is okay. Basically, here's the way to support it. So in short, you need to basically write all the regular expressions to support like every combination, right? Like, so if you've got three possible answers and you want to give partial credit for 2, you've got to do like 3 choose 2 regular expressions. And you can imagine this gets out of hand like really quickly here. So this basically stinks. So after this, and they said, yeah, you can do it, just write this. And I said, no, I got better things to do. So I said, okay, we'll just stick to multiple choice if possible. Main differences between this approach and a regular multiple choice is that it does help to write up explanations so that when people get wrong answers, you can explain why. And the other thing is you can allow students to retake the quiz, right? And if so, how many times? And I think that's interesting. I mean, I guess that's more Coursera pedagogy or something than specific to my course. But I thought that was an interesting twist, because usually when you give a student a multiple choice quiz, it's like written, they take an exam, they write it, they hand it back to you. Here they can do it again. Based on, they answer a wrong answer, you explain why, and then they can take it again. I think that's kind of interesting. Okay, so programming assignments. I wanted to teach both concepts and programming. This is not a heavy-duty programming course. It's not like thousands of lines of code, but some concepts are really best explained through just really short code exercises, a little bit like the one I was showing in the video. So it's possible to submit code, and there are various ways to do it. This is a little bit of an overstatement. Again, the grading typically should be, is easiest when it's done on a regular expression evaluation of the output. So we had some trouble with this as well that I'll describe, because we had something where it was like, create a network emulation and then run some performance tests and give us your performance numbers, right? And we wanted to say, well, if it's within a range, right, then you're okay. Well, ranges in regular expressions, as you know, are fun. Of course, the first problem is we want people to set up a network and then run some performance tests, and well, obviously the person who's running it in Cape Town might have a totally different setup than the person who's running it in California. So what do we do? Different laptops, different, this and that, different hardware, forget it, right? So basically what we did is to say, well, and we took this idea from elsewhere actually, was to basically use a virtual machine. So we, for those of you who don't know what this is basically like a disk image that you can load into a program that's running on your machine here. So I can, for example, even though I'm running a Mac here, I can basically start a program and then load like a Linux disk image into that program, and then it looks as though I'm typing into a Linux machine or whatever. And you can basically do everything that you want inside that application window. So what we said is, okay, well, we're going to pre-package everything, like put all the software that the students need into that disk image, right? And then just have them download it and load it into this virtual machine application. Right? No problem. Actually works pretty well. This generally works. There's a few caveats. One is the virtual machine is pretty big, right? So perhaps a problem for people in certain parts of the world. We kind of anticipated that. So we said, okay, well, it's big, but let's just get it right the first time. So you have to download it once. It's a pain, but then you've got it for the whole course. One thing we didn't anticipate is that not everyone has a 64-bit machine. So there are people that are running machines from 6, 7 years ago trying to do this stuff. And so we had to build like a 32-bit virtual machine image for the course as well later on. One of the things that came up too is even though we're doing emulated networks inside a virtual machine, everything's self-contained on the user's machine inside a virtual machine on their host. Well, if I'm running on this and you're running on that, your network performance might be a little different depending on details of the hardware, etc. Even though it's emulated, it's supposed to be the same. It doesn't always work out. So that's that. Forums. Okay, communicating with 10,000 students, this is basically my worst nightmare. I thought it was going to be my worst nightmare. I thought, look, small glitches in an assignment in a class, of 50, that's mayhem already, right? You make some small mistake in a problem set and you've got people sending you email, knocking on your front door. I just thought, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to spend my entire life, here's a forum, this is just from this morning, and this is 20 minutes worth of stuff, right? And I thought, this is going to be a disaster. Thankfully, this was fine. And actually, the lesson that I've learned from this is actually giving an assignment to 10,000 students in a MOOC is actually easier than giving it to 50 students in a classroom. So here's why. First of all, you do your best to work out the bugs, mostly out of fear, right? Because you're 10,000 people are going to look at this. It better work. Whereas, you're not going to and hope you're going to iron out the kinks on the way with the students in the classroom. We attempted everything we assigned, often on multiple platforms. Obviously, that doesn't actually totally fix the problem. There are still people on the 32-bit machines and so forth. But this is actually something that I had not thought about that is really interesting, which is that the students are self-selecting, right? So they're taking a course because they want to know about the topic. Right? They're not taking it to get a degree or because it's a requirement or because it was the thing that fit into their schedule on Friday mornings. They're actually there because they want to learn the material and they're excited about it. So everyone wants to be there. If they're not, they take off. I'll share that as well, right? But this makes a huge difference, right? Because people not only fix the issues themselves sometimes, they rewrite documentation and so forth. So one example was in the tutorial, I said, here's how to set up your virtual machine, right? And I left out a step in the tutorial video. And this guy not only replied in the forums, but he said, oh yeah, actually I wrote this blog post because I realized in all the documentation out there, there's no good explanation of how to do this one thing. So here's the blog post. I said, thank you, I will use that now for the course documentation. So this is just something when I thought wow, this would never happen in my normal class. You'd get a lot of people complaining and no one actually doing anything. And here it was oh no, I've solved the problem and here it is. One caveat I found with a lot of sort of problems that come up is the platform is still pretty beta. So some of the reading the forums, it's hard to sort of tease apart which of these do I really need to answer versus which of these are just the Coursera platform is still being ironed out. I think that problem will be fixed. So who's taking it? There are about 50,000 people registered. So that sounds huge. But this, by the way, is specific to, these numbers are specific to this course, but this is pretty, if you read about MOOCs on Wikipedia, this is pretty standard. So there are about 50,000 people who basically clicked enroll in this course, right? There are about 10,000 people who are active every week for whatever Coursera's definition of active is. I assume that means they go to the site, they check something out. There are a few thousand watching the lectures every week. And then the programming assignments, there's considerably fewer turning them in. So Right, so I think that's actually kind of about standard. They give you kind of ways to look at like who's tracking, who's doing stuff, like when they've turned it in and so forth. There's a lot more that I don't have time to go into. This has been great. So the numbers are cool. I mean, it's like, oh wow, 10,000 people taking this course. That's awesome. But actually, one of the things I've really loved about it is you don't actually know often who those 50,000 people are until they start writing you. And I've just like seen feedback popping up like both in my email inbox and like on various mailing lists. Like this guy runs like Microsoft Azure. So he's like, he's like, oh yeah, started listening to this. It's totally awesome. I'm like, wow, that's cool. This is the guy who basically wrote the Mininet software that we're using to teach the course. So he writes to his users list and says, I'm taking this course, it's awesome. And like, so all these, and this one is actually, this is an example of some feedback in the forum where the guy is basically like, I wanted to talk about how, you can't please everyone all the time. Like some of these people are like too practical. Some of them are like not practical enough. And there is a bit of that. But it's really kind of exciting and fun to see like, oh, here's this person who, in my view is like some, I respect them a lot, and then all of a sudden, you don't even know they're taking the course, right? And then all of a sudden they're like, this is awesome. It's like, okay, great. I want to do this again. Okay, so some takeaways. One is I think MOOCs really changed the game for instruction. Everybody's watching you, right? And I mean everybody, right? So not just the students, right? Like, I would say like in 7 years of like lecturing in front of a classroom, like I really never got any feedback about like my on-campus teaching. I remember showing up like in the first year and I was like, oh, this networking course is totally outdated. I'm going to overhaul it. Although I spent a ton of time like overhauling it, and then I like told other faculty about it. They're like, that's nice. Whereas, so I was like, okay, right. You see how much effort you put into that the next year, right? Whereas here, it's like the opposite, and almost to like an unpleasant extreme. Like everybody's eyes are on you. So, like as I mentioned, like the luminaries are watching, but also like administrators are watching. So this is one thing that I found like probably the biggest negative in my experience is that everyone's got some skin in the game, right? And like if the thing blows up terribly, then it's not good for deans and things like that. So I definitely got a lot of like, hey, it isn't ready yet, like, what's going on? And I'm like, relax, it's gonna be fine. And like, I think most faculty members are not used to being managed, particularly micromanaged, and definitely everyone's watching. So there's a lot of pressure to do a good job, which is good, right? Because I think it improves the quality of instruction. Whereas, here was like, I knew kind of no one cared, so there's a lot less pressure to do a good job. Not that you don't want to do a good job, but it's just when you have 50 things to do, you're not going to put the time into the thing that someone doesn't care about. So the other thing is that MOOCs are a forcing function for introducing this new media into the classroom. So I really wouldn't have thought even about doing these like on-air interviews for a classroom. It just like didn't even occur to me. But then since I was already doing videos, I was like, why do I need to be the only one speaking? Why don't I get someone else to talk for a change? And people would probably likely decline these anyhow. If you're like, would you come, do a, Google interview for my classroom of 50? They're like, sorry, I'm busy. Versus like, hey, would you like to do this? And maybe thousands of people will watch, and it will only take half an hour of your time. Perfect. So I think also I'm starting to think about how I'm going to reuse some of this content in a real classroom. So that's been really, even if I don't teach the MOOC again, I hope that I do, but even if I don't, I'm definitely going to go back to the real classroom and do things much differently. The other thing is time investment. Okay, so time investment I think really pays off. So I mentioned this at the beginning, right? So let's just kind of, this is loose, right? But let's just kind of compare your typical course creation for 45-minute lecture. Maybe an hour or two to create the slides. This is, I guess, presuming you're good at this by now, right? So if you're a first-year faculty member, it takes longer. But hour or two to create the slides. Maybe an hour to deliver the, walk to the classroom, deliver it, etc. Answer some questions after class. So let's just say that's about 3 hours of your time for a 45-minute lecture. Okay, but then you got to do it again, right? So I've had so many lectures where, I've had some that were bad, and you want to forget about those, but you also have some where you're like, that was awesome. Like, I really liked the way that I explained that thing. And then, man, man, but now I've got to do it all over. Like, I can't remember it, and I'm sitting there like taking photos of the whiteboard, thinking like, I really need to remember how I did that. And of course, you never look at it again. And then the next year rolls around, and you're like, oh, I've got to do it again. How did I do that?